She had $7.40 in her purse, a letter promising her a husband, and a single trunk waiting on the boardwalk of a town that did not want her. Then the sheriff stepped out of the saloon. He smiled at her the way a man smiles at a thing he has already decided to take. His hand came to rest above her elbow, light as a brand, and he said very softly, just at her ear, "Be careful what you marry into, miss. Some doors do not open back outward." She did not yet know that the man she had come west to marry was watching from across the muddy street with a rifle near at hand and a secret in that mountain cabin that would cost her everything she had ever been. This is the story of Adelaide Hartwell and the long road up Holloway Ridge. The wind off the eastern slope of Holloway Ridge carried the first true bite of winter, and Adelaide Hartwell stepped down from the stagecoach into a town that did not want her. Nobody waited at the depot. No husband stood with hat in hand. No wagon idled beside the boardwalk with a man searching the windows for a face he had only known through a few brief letters and a single pressed forget-me-not she had folded into the third envelope. There was only the wind and the smell of wood smoke and horse dung and the silence of men watching her from the doorway of a saloon across the muddy street. She was 24 years old. She had $7.40 in her reticule. She had a single trunk that the driver was already setting down with too much force, as if to be rid of her before whatever shadow hung over this place could reach him. And in her gloved hand gripped so tightly that the paper had gone soft along the creases, she held a letter that had promised her a husband, a home, and a life. The letter had lied. She did not know that yet. She knew only that the man named Ezra Blackwood was not at the depot, and that the town of Iron Creek, Colorado Territory was nothing like the green and gentle valley she had pictured during the long nights on the train from Boston. The buildings leaned. The mud was the color of old iron. A woman crossed the street with her face turned aside, as if catching the eye of a stranger might cost her something. 2 children stood in front of a shuttered general store, and when Adelaide smiled at them, the older one took the smaller by the hand and pulled her inside. Adelaide closed her eyes for the space of one slow breath. Her father had taught her to do this when fear came. Marcus Aurelius, he used to say, holding her small hand in his, ink-stained one, as they sat by the fire in the rented Boston rooms. The obstacle is the way, my Della. Whatever stands before you, stand longer. He had been a Harvard man, a scholar of dead languages, and he had died coughing blood into a basin in the heat of July, leaving her nothing but his books and his debts and a daughter who knew Latin and Greek and could not pay the rent. Stand longer, she told herself. Stand longer. She opened her eyes. A boy of perhaps 14 was crossing the street toward her. Hatless, his ears red with cold. He stopped a respectful 3 paces away, the way a boy is taught to stop before a lady, and he held out a folded slip of paper without a word. "For me?" she said. He nodded. "Lady on the coach asked me to give it to you when you stepped off, ma'am. Said to wait until you were alone." "What lady?" The boy frowned. "Old lady. Nice. Got off 2 stops back at Rusted Spur." Adelaide thought of the kindly woman who had ridden the last leg with her, a Mrs. Beatrice Green, whose husband had once worked the silver claims, and who had pressed a peppermint into her palm when the road grew rough. But Mrs. Green had not gotten off at Rusted Spur. Mrs. Green had gotten off 2 miles before that, at a homestead with a barn painted blue. "Are you certain it was the woman from Rusted Spur?" "Yes, ma'am. She paid me a nickel to wait." He hesitated. Then, with a child's instinct for things that adults pretend not to see, he added, "She was crying when she gave it to me, ma'am." Adelaide gave the boy a coin, and he ran. She stepped into the lee of the depot wall out of the wind and unfolded the paper with hands that had gone suddenly cold inside her gloves. The hand was unfamiliar. The letters were small and quickly made, as if written in haste, perhaps in the dark of a swaying coach. "Do not go up to Holloway Ridge. They have not told you what waits there. There is a thing about that house and those brothers no one will speak of in town, and it will cost you your life if you climb that road. Take the morning coach back to Denver. Use whatever you have. Do not stay the night in Iron Creek. I cannot sign my name. Forgive me. I am trying to save you." Adelaide read it twice. The wind tugged at the corner of the paper, and she gripped it tighter. 3 weeks ago, she had stood at her father's grave in the rain. 2 weeks ago, the Worthington family of Beacon Hill had let her go from her position as governess with a letter of reference that praised her Latin and a half-spoken regret that an unattached young woman of her age was not perhaps suitable for a household with a son of 19. 10 days ago, she had answered an advertisement in the Matrimonial News. "Mountain rancher of Colorado Territory seeks wife of strong character, must read and write a fair hand, must not fear solitude. I am no man for fine talk. I keep my word." Replies to C. Blackwood, Iron Creek. His letters had been short. He had written 5. She had written 6. And in the 6th, she had told him about her mother, who had died when Adelaide was 9, and her father, who had died singing a Greek hymn to a wife 20 years gone, and that she did not have a single soul in the world who would notice if she boarded a train. He had written back one line. "Then come, ma'am. There is a place here for a woman who is not afraid to begin." She had taken that as a vow. Now a stranger she could not name was telling her to flee. She lifted her face into the wind and looked for the first time properly at the men in the doorway across the street. 2 of them had drifted out into the open air, and one had begun to walk toward her with the careful, slightly weighted pace of a man who has spent years not making noise unless he chose to. He was very tall. He was taller than any man Adelaide had seen in Boston, taller than the Worthingtons' elder son, who had played football for Yale, taller than the doctor who had stood over her father in the last days. He wore a long bison hide coat that fell almost to his knees, and a wide-brimmed hat the color of old leather, and he moved through the mud as if mud were no consideration. As he came closer, she could see the line of his jaw under a dark beard kept short by a knife rather than a barber, and the color of his eyes startled her. Amber, not brown. Amber like a candle held behind whiskey. Behind him a second man followed 1/2 a step slower with a slight favoring of the right leg. The first man stopped before her and lifted his hat. "Miss Hartwell." He did not ask. He knew her by the look of her, by the cut of her traveling dress, perhaps by the very particular way a woman from Boston stands when she is afraid and does not wish to show it. "Mr. Blackwood." "Ezra. The other one, he is my brother Silas." The second man, younger, with sun-streaked brown hair and gentler eyes the color of slate before rain, touched his hat brim and gave her the smallest nod. "We are sorry we are late, ma'am. Storm coming off the divide. We had to bring the cattle off the high meadow before we could ride down." Of course. He looked at the trunk. He looked at her. Then he looked very briefly at the slip of paper still half visible in her gloved hand. His amber eyes paused on it for the space of perhaps one breath. He did not ask about it. "Have you eaten today, ma'am?" The question was so unexpected that she felt the threat of foolish tears at the back of her throat. She had been bracing herself on the long ride from Denver for cold inspection. She had imagined a cold-blooded examination of her hips and her teeth, the kind of thing she had heard whispered about mail-order brides among the housemaids of Beacon Hill. She had not prepared for a man who would ask if she was hungry. Not since this morning. "There is a kitchen at the boarding house. Mrs. Henley keeps a kettle. Silas will bring your trunk along after he gets the wagon. It is a long way up the ridge, ma'am, and I do not believe in starting a long ride on an empty stomach." He did not offer his arm. He simply turned and waited for her to walk beside him, and she did, and the wind moved between them like a third presence that he was using his own body to break. They had crossed half the street when the saloon door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall as well, but heavier through the chest, and somewhere in his late 40s, and he wore the badge of a sheriff on the left lapel of a fine black coat that had no business being in a town like Iron Creek. His mustache was waxed. His boots were clean in a town where boots could not be clean. He smiled at Adelaide, and the smile was warm, and the warmth was the worst thing about him. "Well now," he said. "Well, well, well. A new face." Ezra Blackwood did not stop walking until the sheriff stepped sideways into his path. Then he stopped, and the air around him changed the way air changes before a thunderhead. "Sheriff!" "Ezra!" The sheriff did not look at Ezra. He looked at Adelaide. "Ma'am, I am Sheriff Cornelius Holt. I look after this town. I make it my business to know when a young lady arrives in it alone." He touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers. "May I ask what brings you so far from civilization?" Behind him, Silas Blackwood had come up quietly, with the trunk on one shoulder, and his slate eyes, which had been gentle a moment before, were no longer gentle. "I am Mr. Blackwood's intended sir." Sheriff Holt's smile did not change exactly. It only deepened the way water deepens when something passes underneath. "Are you now?" "Yes, sir." "I see." He let his gaze travel slowly back to Ezra. "Well, that is a thing I had not heard. And in a town like Iron Creek, miss, I generally hear things." "The agreement is private, Sheriff," Ezra said. His voice was very low. He had not raised it. He did not need to. Of course it is." Sheriff Holt turned that warm smile back on Adelaide, and his hand very lightly, very politely came to rest just above her elbow. The touch could not have lasted more than a second. It felt like a brand. "Miss, before you ride out of this town, I have a duty as the law in this county to be sure you understand where you are going. The Blackwood place is 40 miles into country that kills men in their prime. The brothers Blackwood have a history here that the decent people of this town do not speak of in front of women. There is a perfectly clean room at my hotel, no charge to a lady. You can rest a night, you can think on what you are about to do, and if in the morning you wish to ride up that mountain, I will pay for your wagon myself." Adelaide felt the blood leave her face. She did not move her arm. She did not pull away from the sheriff's hand. She did not give him the satisfaction. "Sheriff Holt." "Ma'am." "Please remove your hand from my person." For a half a heartbeat, the smile slipped. Then it returned broader, almost amused. He lifted his hand and stepped back with a small bow. "My apologies. A man only wants to be sure." "I appreciate your concern. The offer of the room stands." "It is declined." She did not look at Ezra Blackwood when she said it. She did not need to. She felt him beside her the way one feels the heat of a fire one is walking past, and she felt the faintest shift of his weight, an almost imperceptible easing in the line of his shoulders, as if a string drawn very tight had loosened by half a turn. Silas spoke for the first time, and his voice was lighter than his brother's, with a softer Western shape to it. "She is a married woman in the eyes of the territory sheriff. The papers were filed in Denver. We are taking her home." It was not strictly true. The papers had not yet been filed. But Sheriff Holt's smile cooled by a degree, and he stepped aside, and as Adelaide walked past him with her chin lifted, he said very softly, just at her ear, in a voice meant only for her, "Be careful what you marry into, miss. Some doors do not open back outward." She did not turn her head. She did not give him her face. She walked, and Ezra Blackwood walked beside her, and they crossed the rest of the muddy street together in silence. Inside the boarding house, Mrs. Henley brought a bowl of stew and bread and refused payment and went away into the back rooms without speaking. Adelaide sat at a table by a window streaked with old steam, and she ate slowly because her hands wanted to shake, and she would not allow them to. Ezra sat across from her, his hat on the bench beside him, and he did not eat. He drank a cup of black coffee in 3 small sips and watched the street through the glass. After some time, she set down her spoon. "Mr. Blackwood." "Ma'am." I would like to know what he meant. He did not look away from the window for a moment. Then he did, and his amber eyes settled on her with a gravity that made her aware for the first time that whatever she had imagined a mountain rancher to be, this man was something quieter and harder and more careful than that. "That sheriff," he said, "is the cleanest-looking dirty thing in this territory." "That is not an answer." "No, ma'am, it is not." "Then give me one." He set the cup down. He folded his hands on the wood. They were very large hands. The knuckles were thick with old work, and the back of the left was crossed by a pale, ropey scar that ran from the wrist almost to the small finger. He looked at his own hands as if deciding how much truth they could hold. 3 years ago, he said, my younger sister died. I am very sorry. Her name was Lenora. She was 17. Sheriff Holt and a man named Alistair Vane, who passes for a baron in this town, and is not one. They were the last men to see her alive. There was no body found. There was no trial. The sheriff wrote it down as a mountain accident. My brothers and I, we know better. We have known better for 3 years. We have not been able to prove a single one of the things we know. Brothers. She heard her own voice as if from a small distance. I thought there were 2 of you. There were 3. Our brother Caleb died of a fever the winter after Lenora vanished. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. He went out one night to walk the trap line, and he did not come back. And when we found him, he was sitting with his back against a pine tree, like a man who had decided to rest. The fever took him by morning. So now there are 2. I see. You do not, ma'am. Not yet. I do not expect you to. Then why have you brought me here? He considered her. Outside the window a wagon passed and the light on his face changed. I needed a wife, ma'am. Why? Because a man who lives alone on a mountain with 1 brother and a dead sister becomes a man people in town will believe any story about. I needed a witness in my house, a woman of education and good name, someone who could write a clean letter to a federal marshal in Denver if it became necessary, someone the law would listen to. You want me as a witness. I want you as a wife. The witness is what saves your life and mine while the wife part takes its time. She let that sit in the air between them. She had expected perhaps a lie. She had expected courtship or false warmth, or the kind of smooth reassurance she had grown to mistrust in the houses of Beacon Hill. She had not expected the truth handed to her like a knife laid flat on a table. Take it, or do not. Mr. Blackwood, ma'am, that is the most honest thing any man has ever said to me. It will not be the last if you stay. She picked up her spoon. She finished the stew. The bread was good and dense and a little burned along the bottom, and it tasted somehow of a kitchen she had not yet seen. When she set down the spoon at last, she said, "I will not be deceived again, not by you, not by your brother, not by any man. If I climb that ridge with you, I will be told the truth about what is in that house, all of it, including the parts you have not yet said out loud." Ezra Blackwood looked at her for a long moment. Then he gave the smallest nod a man can give and still call it a nod. "You will." "And Mr. Blackwood?" "Ma'am." "Stand longer. That is what my father used to say. Whatever stands before you, stand longer than it does." She folded her napkin. "I have stood longer than worse than Sheriff Holt." For the first time since the depot, the line of his mouth changed. It was not a smile. It was the place where, in a different man, in a different life, a smile might have begun. "I do not doubt it, Miss Hartwell." The wagon was waiting in the alley behind the boarding house. Silas had laid a fur over the seat and tucked a heated stone wrapped in flannel beneath it, and when Adelaide climbed up, he handed her a second blanket without comment. Ezra mounted the bay gelding tied behind, and Silas took the reins of the wagon, and the three of them moved out of Iron Creek as the early dark was gathering at the foot of the mountains. The road climbed. It climbed for an hour through scrub oak and aspen whose last gold leaves had been stripped by the wind. It climbed past a ruined sluice from a played-out claim. It climbed past a dead cottonwood that had been struck by lightning and never fallen, only stood there silver and broken on the slope. The wagon wheels found every stone. The cold pressed down through the blanket and the fur and the weight of her wool dress, and Adelaide began, in spite of herself, to think about the warm, clean room in the sheriff's hotel and to be ashamed of thinking about it. After the first hour, Silas began to talk quietly, as if he understood that silence on this road would be more frightening than any story. He told her about the cabin which his father had built in the year after the war, when the family had come west from Pennsylvania. He told her about the meadow above it where the cattle wintered. He told her about the spring that ran out of the rock behind the kitchen water so cold it would crack a tin cup in February. He told her about a dog named Old Boone, 15 years old now, blind in one eye, who slept by the stove and would not be dislodged by anything short of a bear. He did not tell her about Lenora. He did not tell her about Caleb. He did not tell her about the sheriff. He told her about a mountain and a house and a dog, and his voice was the voice of a man who had decided, perhaps, for the length of one wagon ride, to give a frightened woman the version of his life that did not have any deaths in it. She was grateful. She did not say so. Behind them, the bay gelding made no sound but the ring of his hooves on stone, and Ezra Blackwood rode in the dark like a man who had ridden in the dark all his life. It was full night when they came out of the last stand of pines and onto the bench of land where the cabin stood. The moon had not yet risen, but there was light in two of the windows, soft and yellow, the kind of light that means a fire and a kettle and a person who has waited up. The cabin was larger than Adelaide had pictured. It was 2 stories. The porch ran the full length of the front, and a stone chimney rose at the southern end, and smoke from the chimney lay along the eaves before lifting away into the cold. There was a barn beyond, and a smaller cabin set apart by perhaps 30 yards, and a corral, and the dim shapes of horses standing patient in the dark. Silas pulled up the team. Ezra dismounted. He came around to her side of the wagon, and he held up his hand, and Adelaide took it and stepped down. His palm was warm through her glove. She had expected the rough, but not the warmth. "This is Holloway Ridge, ma'am. It is beautiful. It is hard. The beauty is a thing it gives you on the mornings it is not killing something. I will remember that." He did not let go of her hand at once. He looked at her across the small space between them in the spilled yellow light from the cabin window, and she saw perhaps for the first time that he was not a young man. He was 35 years old. He had been a soldier. He had buried a brother and a mother and a father and a sister he could not even bury properly. He had written an advertisement for a wife the way a man writes a will, because he could not see another way to keep what was left of his house standing. "Miss Hartwell, Mr. Blackwood, you can sleep in Lenora's room tonight. The door has a bolt. You will hear me in the kitchen if you need me. Silas sleeps in the smaller cabin. We will not enter the house after dark unless you call. In the morning we will speak again, and you will tell me whether you intend to stay, and if you intend to stay, what manner of arrangement will let you sleep at night for as long as you live under this roof. That is a generous offer." "It is not generous. It is the least a decent man can do." He let go of her hand. She stepped onto the porch. The boards under her feet had been planed by hand and worn smooth by years of boots, and someone recently had swept them clean of pine needles. The door had a wrought iron latch that lifted with a small, well-kept click. The smell that came out to meet her was wood smoke and beeswax and bread baked that morning, and the warm dust of old books, and under all of it faintly the green herbal scent of dried lavender. Lavender, on a mountain in Colorado in October. Someone had grown it. Someone once had hung it from rafters to dry. She did not yet understand that she was smelling the small, persistent ghost of a girl named Lenora, who had loved lavender and had been told by every man in her family that it would not survive at altitude, and who had grown it anyway in a clay pot in the kitchen window because she was 17 and stubborn and did not yet know that the world would not allow her to grow up. Adelaide stepped inside. The kitchen was warm. A kettle steamed on the iron stove. The table was set with a single place and a covered dish and a folded cloth and a small jar holding 3 sprigs of dried sage. Beyond the kitchen she could see the front room and the great stone hearth and the shelves of books and a long rifle laid across pegs above the mantel. On a braided rug before the hearth lay a very old yellow dog, who lifted his head when she came in, considered her with the serene authority of an animal who had outlived 3 of his masters, and put his head back down. "Old Boone," she said softly. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. She climbed the narrow stair at the back of the kitchen. The second floor held 3 rooms. The first door stood open. The fire on the hearth below sent enough light up the stairwell that she could see the room dimly. A narrow bed, a washstand, a small writing desk under the window, a wardrobe of dark wood, the door slightly ajar, a handmade quilt folded at the foot of the bed, the pattern half a wedding ring and half something Adelaide did not recognize, perhaps a sister's invention. There was a single pressed flower on the pillow, a forget-me-not. Adelaide stood in the doorway holding her gloves, and she felt the tears come at last, and she did not stop them, because there was no one in the room to see her cry. Down in the kitchen, she heard the soft sound of Ezra Blackwood setting his hat on the peg by the door and speaking very low to the dog. She closed the bedroom door. She did not bolt it. She realized know exactly why she did not bolt it. She set her gloves on the writing desk. She lit the candle on the stand by the bed. She sat on the edge of the quilt and lifted the forget-me-not and held it in her open palm. It was old. It had been pressed for some time, perhaps years. The blue had faded to the color of a winter sky just before snow. In the wardrobe, when she opened it, hung 4 dresses. One was a dark wool plain suitable for work. One was a heavier coat lined with rabbit fur at the cuffs and collar. One was a Sunday dress of deep green with small ivory buttons sewn down the bodice by a hand that had not been quite expert at the work. The fourth was a wedding dress. It was simple. It was cream-colored. It had a high lace collar and long sleeves and a neat row of cloth-covered buttons, and it had never been worn. It had been hung in this wardrobe and waited year after year for a young woman who had not lived to put it on. Adelaide closed the wardrobe with both hands very carefully, as if something inside it might break. She crossed to the writing desk, and she sat down, and she pressed her palms flat to the wood and breathed until her breath came even. Only then did she see the journal. It was tucked between 2 books on the small shelf above the desk, a slim leather-bound volume the color of a chestnut. The leather was scarred along one edge, as if it had been carried often in a saddlebag. There was no name on the cover. She reached for it the way a person reaches for the last step on a stair in the dark, half expecting it not to be there. She opened it. The first page bore a girl's careful copperplate. Lenora Blackwood, 17 years. The 3rd day of September, 1875. This is my book, and I will keep it true. Adelaide turned the pages. A girl's life moved past her hands. A new colt named Banner. A cake that fell. A letter from a cousin in St. Louis. A page of pressed wildflowers, each one named in the same careful hand. Indian paintbrush. Columbine. Bluebell. Lavender. Then a line 3 weeks later in a hand that had begun just slightly to hurry. The man Vane came again today. He stood at the gate while I was hanging linen. He did not come up. He only watched. Ezra was on the high pasture. Caleb was in town. Silas saw him from the barn and walked out with the rifle, and Vane tipped his hat and rode away. Silas did not tell Ezra. He said it would do no good. He said Ezra would ride down and kill the man, and we would lose both my brother and our claim. I think Silas is right, but I am afraid. Adelaide turned the page. The sheriff rode out with Vane this time. They asked after the deed. Ezra told them the deed was in the Denver land office and that they were welcome to ride down there themselves and look at it. The sheriff smiled. I do not like the way the sheriff smiles. He looks at me as if I am a thing on a shelf he has already decided to take down. Caleb says I am not to walk to the spring alone anymore. Adelaide turned the page. Tonight, Vane left a letter under the door. It was for Ezra. I read it before he came home because I was afraid. It said that if Ezra would do a certain thing for a certain man, our family would be left in peace. The certain thing is murder. I burned the letter in the kitchen stove. Ezra will never know. He would do anything for me. He would do that. I will not let my brother become that. Adelaide's hand stopped on the page. She turned it. The next entry was dated almost 2 months later, and the hand had changed again. It was no longer the hand of a girl writing in the safety of her own room. It was a hand that had been writing on her knee, perhaps, or by a poor candle, or in a hurry. I am writing this in the cellar. I do not have much time. If anyone reads this who is not my brothers, please carry word to them. I am alive. Whatever they tell you in town, whatever the sheriff puts in his book, I am alive. Vane and the sheriff did not kill me. They have done a worse thing than killing me. I will not write the worst thing in this book, because I will not have my brothers read it in my own hand. Tell them I am alive. Tell them to come. Beneath that, in a hand that was almost steady again, one final line. If you are reading this, and you are not Ezra or Silas or Caleb, you are in the house where they will come for you next. Do not stay. Do not stay. Adelaide closed the journal. She set it down on the desk very carefully, the way one sets down a thing that is hot to the touch. The candle by the bed had burned down a 1/4 inch. Outside the window the wind had risen, and somewhere on the slope below the cabin a coyote called once and was answered and was silent. She did not yet have all of it. She did not yet know that the body of Lenora Blackwood had never been found because Lenora Blackwood had not died. She did not yet know that a woman with a scar on her cheek and her brother's amber eyes was sleeping at that moment in a hunter's cave 6 miles down the ridge, having survived 3 years no one in this house knew about. She did not yet know that the man she had agreed to marry had been writing letters in his head every night for 3 years to a sister he believed buried in unconsecrated ground. What she knew sitting in a dead girl's room with a dead girl's wedding dress in the wardrobe and a dead girl's journal on the desk was that she had been brought to this house for a reason that had not yet been spoken in full, and that Ezra Blackwood, when he had said in the boarding house that the witness was what would save both their lives, had not been speaking lightly. She had a choice. She could go back down the mountain in the morning. The man waiting at the bottom of the road with his clean boots and his warm smile and his hand that had touched her elbow as if to mark her would receive her at his hotel with great courtesy. He would put her on the next coach to Denver. She would never know what had happened in this house. She would never know what had happened to the girl who had grown lavender against the advice of 3 brothers. She would go home to Boston with an empty trunk and a letter of reference, and she would die eventually in a rented room, having lived a life that did not require her. Or she could stay. She rose. She crossed to the window. The glass was cold and her breath made a small bloom on it, and beyond the bloom she could see down across the dark yard to the lit kitchen window of the small cabin where Silas Blackwood was banking his stove for the night, and she could see on the porch of the main house, just below her own window, the dim shape of a tall man standing in the cold with a coffee cup in his hand, looking out across the meadow toward a country she could not yet see. Ezra Blackwood was keeping watch. He had not gone inside. He had taken up a position at the edge of his own porch in the wind, with no light on him, and he was watching the road that came up from Iron Creek. She understood quite suddenly that he was not watching the road on her behalf. He had been watching that road every night for 3 years. She set her palm flat against the window glass. The cold of it went through her. "Stand longer," her father had said, his voice very soft inside her, like a hand laid on her shoulder. "Whatever stands before you, stand longer than it does." Adelaide Hartwell, 24 years old, the orphan of a Boston scholar and the bearer of $7.40, stood in a dead girl's bedroom on a mountain in Colorado Territory in October of the year 1878, and she made the second great decision of her life. The first had been to answer the advertisement. The second was to stay long enough to learn the truth of what she had walked into and to do something about it, even if the doing of it cost her the life she had only just begun. She would not tell him in the morning. She would tell him now. She picked up the candle. She crossed the room. She opened the door, and she went down the stairs in her stocking feet, and the old yellow dog by the hearth opened both his clouded eyes this time and watched her pass and did not bark. She opened the front door of the cabin. The cold came in, and the cold went out, and Ezra Blackwood on the porch did not turn at once. He let her come up beside him in her own time, the way a man lets a wild thing come close to a fire on its own choosing. "Mr. Blackwood." "Ma'am." "I have read your sister's journal." He did not answer. The cup in his hand did not move. Somewhere down in the dark, very far away, a single horse moved in the corral and was still. "You are going to tell me," Adelaide said, "everything that is in this house. You are going to tell me tonight, not in the morning, not in your own time. Tonight, every name, every grave you cannot find, every letter you have not opened, every reason you posted an advertisement in a Boston newspaper for a woman who reads and writes a fair hand. You are going to tell me, and I am going to listen, and when you are done, I will tell you whether I am staying." A long moment passed. The wind moved her hair. Ezra Blackwood very slowly set the coffee cup down on the porch rail. He did not look at her. He looked out across the meadow where the moon was just beginning to lift above the eastern ridge and lay a thin silver line along the tops of the pines. "All right, Adelaide." It was the first time he had spoken her given name. "All right," he said again. "Sit down. It will take a while." She sat down on the porch step in the cold, and she pulled her shawl tight, and somewhere on the dark road that ran up from Iron Creek, an hour's hard ride below them, a horse was coming slow and patient and unseen, ridden by a young woman with a scar on her cheek, who had been waiting 3 years to come home. Adelaide Hartwell did not yet know that. She knew only that she had stopped running. The morning would find her for the first time in her life in a place she had chosen. He told her on the porch, and the telling took until the moon stood high above the eastern pines. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has carried a thing alone for too long, not in a flood. In careful pieces, like a man laying stones across a river, one at a time, testing the weight of each before he moves to the next. He told her about a father who had come west from Pennsylvania in 1865 with 3 grown sons and a wife already coughing the cough that would kill her 7 years later. He told her about the cabin built one summer with his own hands, and his father's log by log, the chimney laid up by an old Cornish mason who had drifted up from the played-out claims and worked for board and a bottle. He told her about a sister born late in 1858 when her mother was past the age for it. He told her how Lenora had been a child of the mountain in a way that none of her brothers had ever managed, how she could name every bird on the ridge by its call before she was 9, how she had grown lavender in a clay pot in the kitchen window, because 3 grown men had told her it would not survive at altitude. He told her about the war. He did not tell her much. He told her that he had gone east in the spring of '63 with a Pennsylvania regiment, because his mother's people lived there and the call had come through them. He told her that he had been 20 years old at Vicksburg. He told her that the man who had taught him to shoot a sergeant named Hollis from Lancaster County had taken a piece of grape shot through the throat at 4 in the afternoon on the 3rd day of June and had bled to death in Ezra's lap in a culvert under a wagon road, while Ezra had pressed both hands to the wound and prayed the only prayer he could remember, which was the one his mother said over the bread. He told her the wound on his own left shoulder was from Chattanooga 5 months later. He told her he had come home in the spring of '64 with the use of his arm and the knowledge that he would never again raise his voice without a reason because he had heard enough men shouting in his life. Then he told her about Lenora. Adelaide sat very still on the porch step with her shawl around her shoulders, and she did not interrupt him. She watched his hands on the porch rail. She watched the way the knuckles on the left hand whitened and eased and whitened again. He told her about Vane, about the first visit, about the second, about the way the sheriff had begun in the second summer to ride out with Vane on the pretext of checking the deed, about the letters that had begun to come every month a single sheet of good paper folded once, signed only with the printed name of Alistair Vane, and never in his hand. About the names on those letters: a territorial judge in Denver, a surveyor who had ruled against Vane in a water rights dispute, a widow in Iron Creek who had refused to sell her late husband's claim, about the price each letter named for each life and the same price every time written at the bottom in the same printed hand. Lenora returned to her brothers, alive, untouched, within the week. Ezra had burned every letter. He had burned them in the kitchen stove because he could not trust himself to keep them in the house. He had not told Silas. He had not told Caleb while Caleb was alive. He had not until tonight told a living soul. "And my sister," he said, and for the first time his voice changed very slightly, the way a rope changes when one strand has begun to fray. "My sister disappeared on the 11th day of September in '75. Silas was the last of us to see her. She had walked down to the lower spring with a basket. She did not come back. Silas went after her at sundown. He found her basket. He found her shawl. He found a place on the rim of the lower meadow where 2 horses had stood and turned. He went down the cliff face after them in the dark because he thought he heard her call, and his right knee gave out on a loose stone, and he fell 40 feet and lay on a ledge in the cold until first light when I found him." He paused. "He has not walked without a limp since. He does not speak of that night. I do not ask him to. And the body?" "There was no body." "You searched." "I searched for a year, Miss Hartwell. I rode every draw and every box canyon between this ridge and the Wyoming line. I paid Indian trackers. I paid 2 Pinkerton men out of Denver until the money ran out. I found nothing. The sheriff wrote it as a fall. He wrote that her brother in his grief had imagined evidence of foul play. He closed the book. And your brother Caleb stopped eating, stopped sleeping, walked out into a December storm in '75, and was found 3 days later sitting against a pine tree on the North Fork. The fever took him by morning. I sat with him. He was lucid at the end. He said one thing. He said, 'Find her, Ezra.' Then he closed his eyes. Adelaide did not speak for a long time. The moon moved a hand's breadth across the sky. When she spoke, her voice was lower than it had been all night. "And so you posted an advertisement in a Boston newspaper for a woman who could read and write a fair hand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Because a woman of education in your house with letters going out under her name is a witness Sheriff Holt cannot dismiss?" "Yes." "You did not tell me this in your letters?" "No, ma'am, I did not." "Were you going to tell me at all?" He was silent for a long moment. Then he said very simply, "I was going to tell you tonight in the morning after you had slept. I was going to tell you in the kitchen with coffee in your hand. I was not going to let you sign a paper or stand before a preacher without knowing what house you were standing in. That much I had promised myself. The rest I had not yet decided." "What rest?" He turned his head and looked at her then, and the moon was full enough to show her his face. The rest is whether I had any business asking a young woman from Boston to put her name to my name when I cannot promise her a year of life. That is the part I had not yet decided, Miss Hartwell. I will not lie to you and say I had. She let that stand between them. She watched a small brown moth, somehow alive in the cold, beat its wings once against the lit window of the kitchen and fall away into the dark. Mr. Blackwood. Ma'am, I will stay. I will stay tonight, and I will stay tomorrow, and I will stay through the winter. I will write your letters. I will sign my name. I will be a witness in your house. And in return, you will do two things. Name them. You will tell me the truth from this day forward. Every truth, including the ones you think will frighten me. I do not need to be protected from the shape of the thing I have walked into. I need to see it whole, or I cannot help you. I can do that. And the second, ma'am, you will not stand on this porch alone in the cold every night for 3 more years. You have a brother. You have now a wife of sorts. You will let one of us stand watch with you by turns, or you will sleep, and you will trust the door. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, That is harder than the first. I know. I will try. That will do for tonight, Mr. Blackwood. She rose. Her knees had grown stiff. He rose with her slower, and she saw that he was tired in a way she had not seen on him before. The tiredness of a man who has set down a stone he has been carrying so long, his hands have grown around the shape of it. At the door, he stopped and said, without quite looking at her, You will hear me on the stairs in the night sometimes. I do not sleep all the way through. It is a thing left from the war. I will not come past the landing. I know that. Good night, Miss Hartwell. Good night, Mr. Blackwood. She closed the door behind her, and she climbed the stairs, and in the room with the wedding dress and the journal and the pressed forget-me-not, she lay down at last under the quilt of half a wedding ring and half a pattern she did not know, and she slept the dreamless sleep of a person who has finally seen the bottom of the water she has been swimming in. In the morning the world was changed. The first snow had not yet come, but the air had gone hard and clear in the night, and the mountains seemed to have moved closer to the cabin, the way a familiar face moves closer when it stops smiling. Adelaide woke to the smell of coffee and wood smoke and to the distant ring of an axe. She dressed in the dark wool. She braided her hair plain. She came down the stair to a kitchen where a single place had again been set, but where this time there was a small jar of late aster on the table, 3 sprigs blue and tired and lovely set there by a hand she did not yet know. Silas, she thought. She did not know yet how she knew, but she knew. He came in from the porch a moment later with his hat in his hand and stamped the cold off his boots, and he gave her a careful good morning and told her in his lighter western voice that his brother had gone before sunrise to bring down a steer from the high pasture and would not be back until the middle of the day. He told her the eggs were in the basket by the cellar door. He told her the flour was in the bin under the counter. He told her old Boone would tell her when a stranger came onto the place, as the dog could no longer see well, but his ears worked yet. He told her with great seriousness that the cook stove had a temper and that it would do as it pleased on Tuesdays. Adelaide laughed for the first time since Boston. The laugh surprised her. It surprised him too. He looked at her for a half a second, as if she had spoken Latin, and then his slate eyes warmed, and he ducked his head and went back out to the barn. She made breakfast for the 2 of them, eggs and biscuits and fried side meat, and when Silas came in to eat, She set a plate for him without asking, and he sat down without comment, and they ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable but only new. After she asked him to show her the place, he took her first to the smokehouse, and to the spring, and to the root cellar, and to the small house where he slept, which was clean as a chapel, and held one bed and one chair, and a fiddle hung on a peg. He took her to the barn where 2 horses stood, and a third nodded in a back stall, and to the corral where a young mare with a white blaze was being broken slow. He told her the names of the horses. He told her which bridle hung on which peg and why. He showed her the rifle rack inside the kitchen door, the locked box of cartridges above it, the place where the spare key to the box was hidden under the 3rd floorboard from the wall. He showed her these things without asking whether she wished to know them, because he had already understood in a way Ezra had not yet understood, that this woman did not intend to be kept ignorant of any tool in any house she lived in. Then he took her to the kitchen window where Lenora's clay pot still stood. The lavender in it was dead, but the dry stalks had been left because no one in the house had been able to bring himself to throw them away. Silas stopped in front of the pot. He did not look at it. "You have read her book." "Yes. Ezra told me last night." "Did he?" "He told me everything, ma'am. He told me he had told you." "Then you know I know." "I know you know." He turned the brim of his hat slowly through his fingers. "Miss Hartwell, I have one thing to say, and I will say it once, and I will not say it again because my brother will not say it for himself in any 100 years. Say it." He would not have written that advertisement in any other year. He held out for 3. He held out until the night Caleb died, and 1 more year past that and another before he could bring himself to put the words on paper. He is not a man who asks. He is a man who does without. When he wrote that letter to Boston, ma'am, he was writing it because he had run out of ways to keep this house standing on his own. He has not slept a full night since 75. He will not say so. I am saying so. Silas put his hat back on. If you can stand him, ma'am, he will be the steadiest thing you ever stood beside. If you cannot stand him, please do not let him hope. That is all. Mr. Blackwood. Silas, ma'am. Silas, I do not yet know whether I can stand him. I know that I am going to try. I know that I have read his sister's last words. I know that I sat on the porch last night and watched him keep watch for 3 years in the space of 1 hour. He does not need to be promised anything. He needs to be helped. I came here to be a wife of sorts. I find I am also going to be a hand. Will you teach me what I do not know? Silas Blackwood looked at her for a long moment, and his slate eyes filled with something that was not tears, but was close, and he said, Yes, ma'am. I will teach you what you do not know. That was the first day. The second day she split her first stick of kindling, and the third day she split 100, and on the fourth day Ezra Blackwood came in from the high pasture in the long blue dusk, and stopped in the doorway of his own kitchen, and saw a woman in his sister's apron pulling a tray of biscuits from the oven, and old Boone asleep at her feet, and the kerosene lamp lit, and the coffee made, and he stood there for a very long moment without speaking, and Adelaide pretended for his sake not to have seen him stop. That evening at supper, he asked her whether she could read aloud. I can. Would you? After. The lamp on the small table. He looked at his plate. It has been a while since there was a voice in this room that was not mine or my brother's. She read to them from a battered copy of Ivanhoe that had belonged to their mother. She read for 1 hour. Silas mended a bridle. Ezra cleaned a rifle and then set it aside and only listened, his amber eyes on the fire. And once during a passage about a wounded knight carried home through a winter forest, he closed his eyes, and Adelaide saw very briefly that he had gone somewhere else, and she did not know yet whether he had gone to a Pennsylvania regiment in 1863 or to a December slope in 75, where a brother had sat against a pine, but she lowered her voice for that passage, and she gave him the small dignity of not noticing. When she closed the book, Silas said very softly, "Ma'am, I have not heard that story since my mother read it. Thank you." Ezra said nothing. Later, as she climbed the stair, she heard him say to his brother in the kitchen below, in a voice she was not meant to hear, "She reads like our mother." "I know," Silas said. "It is not fair." "No," Silas said. "It is not. But it is good, brother. Let it be good." The first snow came on the 7th night. It came light and steady and without wind, and in the morning the meadow was white, and the pines were silver, and Ezra rode out before dawn to bring down the last of the cattle. Adelaide was given the kitchen and the cellar and a list of things in Silas's careful copper plate that were to be done before snowfall became serious. She did them. She did more than them. She found the lavender pot in the kitchen window, and she emptied the dry stalks very gently into the stove, and she filled the pot with new earth from the cold frame, and she planted 3 sprigs of dried sage from the jar on the table, because sage would survive what lavender could not, and a window without anything growing in it was not a window she could bear to look at. When Ezra came in at noon, mud and snow to his thighs, and stopped at the kitchen window to wash his hands at the basin, he looked at the pot for a long time. He did not say anything. He laid one hand very briefly on the rim of it. Then he went to dry his hands. Adelaide turned away to the stove so that he would not see her face. That afternoon a wagon came up the road. Old Boone heard it before any of them, and he rose stiff and growling from the rug and went to the door, and Ezra took down the rifle from above the mantel without hurry, and Silas came in from the barn with the second rifle, and Adelaide, without being told, went to the locked box and turned the key. It was a single wagon. It was driven by a thin, gray-haired woman in a black coat. There was no man with her. She drove up to the porch, and she stopped the team, and she sat for a moment with her hands folded on the reins as if gathering herself. Then she lifted her face. It was Beatrice Green. Adelaide knew the face from the stagecoach. The kindly woman with the peppermints, the woman who had gotten off supposedly 2 stops before Iron Creek. The woman a 14-year-old boy had insisted on a town street had pressed a slip of paper into his hand with tears in her eyes. Adelaide stepped out onto the porch with her shawl tight around her, and Ezra and Silas stepped out behind her, and Mrs. Green looked at the 3 of them and let out a breath that seemed to have been held for a week. "Mr. Blackwood," she said. "Mr. Blackwood, Miss Hartwell, I have come to apologize, and I have come to confess, and I would be obliged if you would let me do both inside. I am old, and I am cold, and I have a thing to tell you that I should have told 3 years ago." Ezra Blackwood did not lower the rifle at once. He looked at Adelaide. Adelaide met his eyes and gave him the smallest nod. He lowered the rifle. He stepped down from the porch, and he handed Mrs. Green down from the wagon as if she were his own grandmother, and Silas took the team to the barn, and Adelaide held the door. In the kitchen, Mrs. Green sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee and her shoulders shaking very slightly under the black coat, and she would not begin to speak until Adelaide had sat down across from her, and Ezra had taken the chair at the head of the table, and the door to the porch had been closed against the cold. "It was me," she said. It was me who wrote the note. I know, Adelaide said. Ezra's head came up. I knew when I read it last night, Adelaide said. I did not know your name then. I only knew that the hand was an older woman's, and that whoever had written it had been close enough to me on the road to know my face and afraid enough not to sign. There were not very many candidates, Mrs. Green. You are too clever a girl for this country. That remains to be seen. Mrs. Green set the cup down. She looked at Ezra, and then at the closed door, and then at her own hands, which were the small spotted hands of a woman who had outlived 2 husbands and 3 sons. Mr. Blackwood, my late husband worked the silver claims for 14 years. He died in the spring of '74. He left me a small house in Iron Creek, and a small income, and the friendship, such as it was, of certain people in that town. One of those people is Sheriff Cornelius Holt. She paused. I am ashamed of that friendship. I am here to put it down. Go on, Ezra said. In the autumn of '75, 2 weeks before your sister disappeared, the sheriff came to my kitchen. He brought a bottle. He drank the bottle. He did not drink it all alone. Mr. Blackwood, because I am not a fool, and I have lived among hard men, and a woman my age learns when to pour and when to pretend to pour. He spoke that night about your sister. He spoke about her in a way no decent man speaks about a girl of 17. He spoke about her as if she were a thing that had already been decided. I told him to leave my house. He laughed. He told me that in this country a woman on her own ought to know her friends. Then he left. You did not warn us. No, Mr. Blackwood, I did not. Her voice broke for the first time. I did not, and I have lived with that. I told myself I had no proof. I told myself a drunk man's filth was not evidence. I told myself the Blackwoods were strong and could mind their own. 2 weeks later, your sister was gone, and I have not slept a clean night since. Ezra did not move. His hands lay flat on the table. There is more, Mrs. Green said. Tell it. 2 months ago, the sheriff came to my kitchen again. He had had no bottle this time. He was sober. He told me very plainly that he had heard a young woman of education was coming up from the east to be your wife. He told me that this young woman would perhaps be persuaded in town to take a different road. He told me he would consider it a kindness if I, who had ridden the eastbound coach often enough to know the drivers would ride down to Denver and ride back with this young woman, and would, if I judged her of fragile constitution, suggest to her in the friendliest terms that the Blackwood place was not safe for a lady. He paid me $20. He said there would be more after. Adelaide felt the cold travel down her spine. She did not move. And so, Mrs. Green said, her voice very small now, I rode down to Denver. I rode back with you. I was kind to you on the coach, Miss Hartwell, because I am not entirely without conscience, and because once I had sat across from you for 2 hours, I understood that the sheriff had not sent me to talk you out of a marriage. He had sent me to mark you. He wanted to be sure of your face. He wanted to be sure that the woman who stepped off the coach at Iron Creek was in fact the woman from Boston, and not some cousin or sister come in her place. I was the eyes. I do not believe he ever intended me to talk you out of anything. He intended me only to say yes when he asked at the depot, that is the one that one is hers. And you wrote the note. I wrote it in the dark of the coach the night before we reached Iron Creek. I gave it to a boy with a nickel. I told him to wait until you were alone. It was the best I could do, child. I could not stop the sheriff. I could not warn the Blackwoods directly without being seen. I could only put a piece of paper into your hand and pray." A long silence held the kitchen. Then Ezra Blackwood spoke in a voice so level it was almost gentle. "Why have you come up here today, Mrs. Green?" "Because last night the sheriff sent a man to my house. The man asked me what I had told the young lady on the coach. He asked it 3 times. He looked through my desk. He took 2 letters that did not concern him. He told me on his way out that the sheriff would call on me himself in the morning to ask the same question. I did not wait for the morning. I harnessed the team at 3 o'clock and I drove up. I am 67 years old, Mr. Blackwood. I have 1 nephew left. I will not live on that man's leash 1 more day. I have come to tell you what I know and to ask if you will have me for a corner of your barn for 1 night, because if I go back to Iron Creek, I will not be there in the morning." Ezra Blackwood looked at his brother across the kitchen. Silas met his look and gave 1 short nod. "You will not sleep in the barn, Mrs. Green," Ezra said. "You will sleep in the small room at the back of the kitchen. We will send for your nephew tomorrow. In the meantime, there are things you have not yet told me, and there is one thing in particular I will ask you now, and you will answer." "Ask Mr. Blackwood." "In the autumn of '75, did the sheriff ever speak in your kitchen of a man named Alistair Vane?" Beatrice Green laughed. It was a short, bitter laugh, the laugh of a woman who has been waiting a long time to be asked the right question. "Mr. Blackwood, Cornelius Holt has been speaking of Alistair Vane in my kitchen since 1872. He has been speaking of Vane as a man speaks of a hand puppet. He has been speaking of Vane the way a master speaks of a dog that is sometimes useful and sometimes inconvenient. Whatever you have believed about who is the dog and who is the master in this country, Mr. Blackwood, I am here to tell you that you have had it the wrong way around for 6 years." The cup in Ezra Blackwood's hand did not move, but the knuckles of his left hand on the table went slowly white, and then slowly white again, and then he set the cup down with the careful precision of a man who has only just decided not to throw it through a wall. "Sheriff Holt," he said. "Sheriff Holt," Mrs. Green said. "All of it. All these years. The letters in Vane's name. The judge in Denver. The widow. My sister. All of it, Mr. Blackwood. Mr. Adelaide reached across the table and laid her hand very lightly over his. She did not say anything. She did not need to. He looked down at her hand on his, and he did not move his hand away, and after a long moment he turned his palm up under hers and let her fingers settle into the rough of his palm, and that was the first deliberate touch between them, and it was not the touch of a man and a woman in any softer story, but the touch of 2 people who had just understood that the war they were in was bigger than either of them had thought. That night, after Mrs. Green had been put to bed in the back room with 2 extra quilts, and old Boone curled at her door, Ezra and Silas Blackwood sat at the kitchen table with Adelaide between them, and they wrote in her hand a letter to a federal United States Marshal in Denver named Tobias Hayes, whose name had been one of 3 on a short list Ezra had kept for 3 years against the day he might find a witness whose word would carry. She wrote slowly. She wrote in the careful copper plate she had been taught at 12. She wrote what Ezra told her to write, and she added of her own accord 2 lines at the end about her own observations of the sheriff at the depot, and about the bruise his fingers had left above her elbow that she had not mentioned to anyone. She signed her full name. She sealed the letter with wax from the candle stub. She gave it to Silas, who would ride at first light to a station house 30 miles to the south, where the eastbound mail still ran, and from there it would go to Denver in the hand of a man Silas trusted because Silas had pulled him out of a frozen creek in '73. When the letter was sealed, Ezra rose and went to the door and stood looking out at the dark yard. Adelaide. It was the second time he had used her name, and her name in his voice had begun to sound like a thing that belonged in his mouth. Yes. You did not have to put your name to that letter. I know. You have made yourself an enemy of the only law in this county. I know that too. He did not turn from the door. Do you understand, he said, that there is now no road back for you that does not go through the rest of this? Do you understand that you cannot, after tonight, take the morning coach and pretend that you were never here? You have signed your name on a federal complaint. The sheriff will know it within the week. He will not let that lie. Do you understand? I understand, Mr. Blackwood. Ezra, she paused. She looked at the back of his neck at the place where the dark hair curled against the collar of his shirt. Ezra. Yes. I understood it before I signed. He closed his eyes. She could not see his face, but she saw the small movement of his shoulders, the way a man's shoulders move when something inside him has given a quarter turn after years of being locked. He did not turn around. He said very quietly into the dark beyond the door, "You are home now, Della." It was the first time he had called her that. It was the name her father had used. She had not told him her father had used it. Adelaide Hartwell sat at the kitchen table of a stranger's house on a mountain in Colorado Territory with a sheet of cooling sealing wax in front of her and a fire burning low in a stove that had a temper on Tuesdays, and she put her face in her hands for one breath, only one, and then she lifted her face again, dry-eyed, and said in a voice that did not shake, "I am home now, Ezra." Outside, very far away, a single horse was coming up the road. It was moving slowly. It was moving the way a horse moves under a rider who knows the road in the dark and is in no hurry to be seen. It would not reach the cabin until almost dawn. It carried a young woman with a scar on her right cheek who had been waiting 3 winters in a hunter's cave 6 miles down the ridge for a sign that it was safe at last to come home, and who had decided tonight, watching from the timber the lit windows of her father's cabin and the silhouette of a strange woman moving past those windows with a kettle in her hand, that the sign she had been waiting for had finally come. Lenora Blackwood was riding home. She did not yet know that the woman she had glimpsed through the glass had spent the evening writing a letter that would, before another moon was full, bring the United States government up the road behind her. She knew only that for the first time in 3 years, the kitchen window of her father's house had 3 sprigs of fresh sage growing in the lavender pot. That was enough. She rode on. The horse came out of the dark, just as the sky behind the eastern ridge began to lift from black to the color of old tin. Old Boone heard it first. He rose from the rug by the kitchen stove with a slow grunt and went to the door and stood there with his ears working in a way they had not worked in 3 years, and Ezra, who had been sitting at the table with a rifle across his knees and a cup of coffee gone cold beside him, raised his head. He did not lift the rifle. He sat very still, and he listened, and after a moment his face changed in a way Adelaide, watching him from the foot of the stair, would remember for the rest of her life. It was not the face of a man preparing for an enemy. It was the face of a man who had heard very far away a sound he had stopped letting himself listen for. "Silas," he said. Silas was already coming through the back door from the small cabin, his coat half on his hair, wet from the basin. He looked at his brother. He looked at the door. He did not ask. He took the second rifle from the rack and stepped to the front window and put his face to the glass. "One rider," he said. Slow, coming up the meadow road, not the cut. Whoever it is, brother, they want to be seen. Adelaide, Ezra said without turning. Yes, stay on the stair. If I go to the door and I do not come back inside in 1 minute, you will go to the back room and you will wake Mrs. Green, and you and she will go down through the cellar and out the storm hatch and into the timber, and you will not stop running until you are at the cut where the road bends, and you will keep going. Do you understand? I understand. Promise me. I promise you. He rose. He set the rifle on the table. He did not pick it back up. Silas opened his mouth to say something, and Ezra lifted one hand, and Silas closed his mouth, and the brothers looked at each other across the kitchen for the space of a breath, and a thing passed between them that did not need words. Ezra walked to the door. He opened it. He stepped out onto the porch in his shirt sleeves in the cold without his hat. The rider had stopped at the edge of the yard where the road came out of the timber. The sky behind the rider had gone from tin to pewter, and there was just enough light now to see the shape of a small horse and a small figure on its back sitting straight, both hands visible on the saddle horn. Ezra Blackwood stood on his own porch and did not move. The rider lifted one hand very slowly and pulled back the hood of a man's wool coat that was too big at the shoulders. The hair was longer than he remembered, 3 winters longer. The face was thinner. There was a line down the right cheek pale against the cold that had not been there before. But the eyes were the same. The eyes were his own eyes and his father's eyes, and they were looking at him across a yard of frosted ground in the gray light before a Colorado dawn. Ezra Blackwood went down on his knees on his own porch. He did not make a sound. He went down the way a tree goes down all at once without struggle, and he put one hand flat on the porch board, and he stayed there with his head bent, and Adelaide, watching from inside the kitchen door, pressed both her hands to her mouth and did not cry, only because she understood with the sudden full clarity of it that this moment was not hers. Lenora Blackwood swung down from the saddle. She walked across the frosted yard in her dead brother's wool coat and her own scuffed boots, and she came up the porch steps one at a time, and she stopped in front of the man, kneeling on the boards, and she put both her gloved hands on either side of his bent head, and she said in a voice rough with 3 years of not being used, "Ezra." He lifted his face. "It is me," she said. "It is me, brother. It is me." He did not stand. He turned his face into the palm of her right hand, the way a child turns into a mother's palm, and he closed his eyes, and Lenora Blackwood, who had survived things that no one in this house yet knew the names of, bent down and put her forehead against the top of her brother's head, and held him there in the cold, while the sky behind them turned from pewter to the first pale rose of morning. Silas came through the door behind Adelaide. He stopped. He stood in the doorway with his rifle in one hand and his other hand braced against the frame, and he looked out across the porch at his brother on his knees and his sister bent above him, and Adelaide saw his right knee buckle the bad one, the one he had broken on a cliff face in '75, going down after the sister he had thought he had not saved, and she stepped forward without thinking and put her shoulder under his arm and held him up, and Silas Blackwood, 33 years old, who had not wept at his brother Caleb's grave because he believed it had been his fault, wept now into Adelaide Hartwell's hair while his sister came home. The sun cleared the ridge. They went inside. They went inside slowly because Lenora's legs were unsteady from the long ride and from the long 3 years before it, and because Ezra would not let go of her hand even to open the door, and because Silas, leaning on Adelaide, was using his bad leg badly. They came into the kitchen as a single moving thing, 4 bodies that had been broken in different ways, and were now, for the space of one morning, holding each other up. Adelaide put the kettle on. She did not ask. She did not speak. She set out 4 cups and the bread from the night before, and the small jar of preserves Beatrice Green had pressed on her at the door of the back room when she had heard the horse, and she retreated to the corner by the stove and stood there with her hands folded into her apron and gave the family the kitchen. Lenora Blackwood sat in her father's chair. She had not sat in that chair in 3 years. She put both her hands flat on the wood of the table, and she breathed, and she looked at her 2 living brothers across the table, and she said in the same rough voice, "Where is Caleb?" A silence opened in the kitchen. Ezra did not look away from her. He did not soften it. He did not, Adelaide saw, allow himself the cowardice of letting Silas tell her. "Caleb died, Lenora, the winter after you went. The fever took him. He is buried under the sycamore by the lower spring where Mother is." Lenora closed her eyes. She did not cry. She had cried perhaps all the tears she had in her in some other room, in some other year, in some place. None of them had been with her. She nodded once. She opened her eyes. "All right," she said. "All right. I will go to him today. We will go with you." "Yes. Together." She looked at her hands on the table. "There are things I need to tell you. There are things I cannot tell you yet. There are things I will only ever tell once, and I will only tell them if there is reason. Some of what was done to me, brothers, I will not put into your heads. You will have to live without knowing. Do you understand me?" "Yes," Ezra said. "Yes," Silas said. "What I will tell you is this. I did not die. Vane did not kill me. The sheriff did not kill me. They did a worse thing which I will not describe, and they sent me away, and I survived it, and I came back. I have been within 6 miles of this porch for 8 months. I did not come up because I believed Holt would kill the both of you the day I showed my face on this ridge. I believed he would burn this house with you in it. I have watched the road from a place in the timber for 8 months, and I have written notes I could not send, and I have eaten what I could trap, and what an old Ute woman left for me at a stone by the creek without ever asking my name. I came tonight because Beatrice Green's wagon went up this road yesterday at sundown and did not come back down, and because I knew Beatrice Green, and because I knew that if Beatrice was running from Holt, then Holt had begun the last move of this game, and that I would rather die at my own door than not be in this house for the end of it." "Lenora," Ezra said. "Yes, brother." "Why did you not come up last night when you saw the new woman in this house?" Lenora turned her head. For the first time she looked fully at Adelaide, who was still standing in the corner by the stove. The amber eyes were very steady and very tired, and there was no apology in them, only a kind of clean, hard recognition, the look of one woman who has survived a thing, taking the measure of another woman who is about to be asked to. "Because I was not yet sure of her," Lenora said. "Silas wrote me a note in the autumn and left it under the stone at the creek. He told me Ezra had posted the advertisement. I knew what it meant. I knew Ezra had decided he could no longer hold this house alone, and that he was going to bring a woman into the line of fire to save it. I have spent 3 years inside what these men do, ma'am. I rode down to Iron Creek the day before your coach was due. I left my horse 2 miles out and I walked in. I watched the depot from the upper window of an empty house Beatrice Green's nephew owns at the end of the street, and in the gray of that morning, I saw Beatrice Green get off the eastbound coach, and I saw her press a folded paper into the hand of a boy I did not know, and I saw the boy nod and run, and I knew, ma'am, that someone in this country had warned you before I had a chance to." Beatrice Green looked up from the table, startled to be addressed in this manner, and Lenora gave her a small grave nod, the kind a daughter gives a mother, and Beatrice put one hand to her mouth. "You did right by me, Beatrice," Lenora said. "You did better than I knew how to do. I waited in that house to see whether the sheriff would take this woman to his hotel. When she walked across the muddy street with my brother instead, I went back up the ridge to my cave, and I prayed, and I did not come up this mountain because I did not yet trust that she would not run. Forgive me, Adelaide. I needed to see you stay before I came home." "There is nothing to forgive," Adelaide said. Lenora looked back at her brothers. "The woman from Boston has stayed." "She has stayed," Ezra said. "Then the time for waiting is over. Bring me coffee, brother. Sit. There is one piece of this you do not yet have, and you will need it before nightfall." Adelaide brought the coffee. She brought 4 cups, and she set them down, and she did not retreat to the corner this time. Lenora looked at her, and Lenora gave her the smallest possible nod, and Adelaide sat down at the table beside Ezra Blackwood, and Lenora began. "2 weeks ago," Lenora said, "Cornelius Holt killed Alistair Vane." Ezra's cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "At Vane's house, late at night. There was no fight. Holt walked into the study, and he shot Vane through the back of the head, as Vane sat at his desk, writing a letter, and he put the gun in Vane's hand, and he wrote a confession in Vane's hand on the half-written letter, and the confession said that Vane had killed me 3 years ago, and that Vane could no longer carry the guilt, and that Vane was taking his own life. The body was found by a maid the next morning. The sheriff investigated the sheriff's own crime. The sheriff closed the book." "How do you know this?" Silas said. "Because the maid is a girl named Polly Mears, and Polly Mears is the niece of the old Ute woman who has been leaving food at my stone, and Polly Mears walked 6 miles up the creek the night after the body was found and told her aunt every word she had seen. She saw the way the gun was in Vane's hand. It was in the wrong hand, brothers. Vane was right-handed. The gun was in the left." A small, grim sound came out of Ezra Blackwood, not a laugh, but the place where a laugh would be in a man who had stopped being capable of them. "So, Vane is dead. Vane is dead. And the letters that have come to this house every month for 3 years in Vane's name were never in Vane's hand. You said it yourself, brother. They were printed. They were never signed in script. You assumed Vane was the writer because Vane signed his own paper letters in your sight. He never wrote a single one of those monthly letters to you. Holt wrote them all. Holt printed them so that no hand could ever be matched. The letters that came to this house promising my return in exchange for a man's life were Holt the whole time. I was never Vane's prize. I was Holt's leash on you. He wanted you to kill judges and witnesses for him so that he could rise in this territory on the bodies you laid down, and when you would not, he kept me alive somewhere only he could reach, and he sent the letters anyway, year after year, to keep you bent. And now that he believes I am dead in fact, and not only on paper, and now that Vane is no longer useful to him, he has cleaned the table. He has killed Vane. He has set Vane up to take the blame for me. He has made of himself the lone law in this county, and he has this week decided that the last loose threads of this story are the 2 men who would not kill for him and the woman from Boston who has put her name on a federal letter. The kitchen went quiet. The fire ticked in the stove. Beatrice Green came out of the back room in her black coat with her gray hair braided and pinned, and she looked at the family at the table, and she looked at Lenora, and her old hand went to her mouth, and she said very softly, "Oh, oh, child, oh, you are her." Lenora rose. She crossed the kitchen. She took Beatrice Green's hand in both her own and bent and kissed the old woman's spotted knuckles, and she said, "You wrote a note for a girl on a coach who had nothing to do with us. You did that for nothing. You did that because you are decent. Sit down. Drink coffee. You are family in this house from this morning on." Beatrice Green sat down in the chair Adelaide pulled out for her, and she put her face in her hands, and she wept silently into her palms, and Adelaide laid one hand on her shoulder and let her weep, because there are some weepings that do not need to be hushed. When Beatrice Green had quieted, Ezra Blackwood spoke. He spoke slowly. He spoke the way he had spoken on the porch in the dark, like a man laying stones across a river. "Lenora." "Yes, brother." "How long do we have?" "He will come tonight." "You are sure?" "I am sure. He was watching the Green place from across the street when she drove out at 3 in the morning. The man he had sent to her house had stayed to watch. The man rode straight to Holt at 4. By dawn, Holt knows Beatrice Green is on this ridge. By mid-morning he knows she has not come down. By midday he will have decided. He will not wait another day. He will come tonight with whatever men he can put in a saddle, and he will come up the road the way you ride to a thing you mean to finish, and he will bring fire." "How many?" 5, 6, not more. He has lost Vane's purse. He pays out of his own pocket now, and he does not pay well. There are not many men in Iron Creek who will ride against the Blackwoods in the open at night. He will bring the ones who already have blood on them and cannot say no to him. Will the new sheriff in Denver believe my letter? Eventually, not tonight. Ezra Blackwood looked across the table at Adelaide. "How many days," he said, "since Silas put your letter on the southbound mail?" "This is the 3rd day. Marshal Hayes is in Denver." "He is. If he is the man you have written him to be, he is on the road by now. Perhaps is not enough." He turned to Silas. "Brother." "I know," Silas said. "You will not like it. I know that too. You are the only one of us who will not be expected. The sheriff has Vane's man watching this road. He does not have a man on the deer trail above the North Fork. You can be off this ridge by noon. You can be at the rail station at Rusted Spur by sundown. You can be on the eastbound to Denver by midnight. You can be at the marshal's office by morning. My leg will not stand the deer trail at speed, brother. Your leg will stand what we ask it to stand tonight." Silas looked at his brother. He nodded once. Lenora reached across the table and laid her hand on her younger brother's wrist. "Silas." "Yes. Twice in your life you have ridden through your own pain because I needed you to. The first time was the cliff at the lower meadow. You did not save me that night, brother. But you did not stop trying, and what you did saved me later in ways you do not know. Tonight is the second time. Ride. Do not look back. Do not lose that horse. Do not stop at the saloons in Rusted Spur. Eat in the saddle. We will be alive when you come back, all of us, and we will be alive because of you." Silas Blackwood did not speak. He stood. He went to his small cabin. He came back in 15 minutes in his good coat with 2 pistols at his hip and a saddlebag over his shoulder, and he stood in the kitchen door and looked once at every face in that room, at his brother, at his sister returned, at Beatrice Green at the table, at the old yellow dog by the stove, at Adelaide. He looked at Adelaide a half-second longer than at any of the others, and he said, "Della." It was the first time he had used the name Ezra used. It was not a slip. It was a deliberate thing given as a brother gives a name. "Yes, Silas. Stand by him tonight." "I will." "He does not know how to ask. He never has." "I know." Silas Blackwood went out the kitchen door, and he limped to the barn, and 10 minutes later they heard the soft drum of hooves on the deer trail above the cabin, climbing the back of the ridge going north and east toward a railhead 30 miles away. It was just past 9 in the morning. They had until dark. What they did between 9 and dark was the work of people who had decided to live. Ezra walked the cabin and the outbuildings. He set Lenora at the kitchen window with a rifle across her knees. He set Beatrice Green in the back room with the good shotgun and 1 box of shells and the whispered promise that no one would come to that door without her hearing. He set Adelaide at the front room window with the second rifle and a pile of cartridges in the lap of her apron. He went out to the barn, and he came back with 2 heavy oak planks that had been sawn in '73 for a project his father had not lived to finish, and he braced the front door from the inside and the back door, and he covered the cellar hatch with a full barrel of meal, and he took down the rifle from above the mantel, and he laid it across the kitchen table, and he sat down finally at noon with a cup of coffee in his hands and his sister at one elbow and his future wife at the other. "Lenora." "Yes." "There is something I have not asked you." "Ask it." "After tonight, whatever happens, will you stay?" She looked at her brother across the kitchen table of the house she had been born in. "I will stay, Ezra. I will stay if we live. I will stay in this house, and I will eat at this table, and I will sleep in my own bed, and I will plant lavender again in the spring, and I will not run from this country 1 foot more. They have had 3 years of me. They will not have another hour." He nodded once. He set down his cup. "All right," he said. "All right then." Dusk came at 5:30. The wind dropped at sunset the way it sometimes does in Colorado in late October, and the snow on the meadow took on the rose color of the last light, and then the rose went, and the gray came down, and the gray went, and the dark came up the slope from the timber as steady as a tide. They lit no lamp in the front room. They lit 1 small candle in the back kitchen behind a wool blanket nailed over the window. Old Boone lay across the kitchen door with his blind eye to the wood and his good ear cocked, and he did not sleep. At 7, they heard the horses. Many horses, more than 5, more than 6. Adelaide at the front window counted the dark shapes coming up the meadow road in a loose line, and she counted 9, and her breath stopped for 1 bad beat because they did not have the powder for 9. And then she counted again as the lead horse came clear of the lower timber, and she saw the lantern on the hat of the lead rider, and she saw the second lantern and the third, and the line of mounted men behind them, coming on at the easy pace of men who knew they were the law in their own country. "Ezra," she said very softly, "I see them. There are more than 6. I see that too." He came up behind her at the window. He laid 1 hand briefly on the crown of her head, the way a man lays his hand on the head of a thing he loves. He did not say anything. He went to the kitchen door, and he opened it, and he stepped out onto the porch in the cold, in his shirt sleeves again, with the rifle held loose in his right hand pointed at the porch boards. The line of horses reached the edge of the yard. Sheriff Cornelius Holt rode at the head. He was wearing the same fine black coat he had worn on the muddy street of Iron Creek. The badge on the lapel caught the lantern light. He stopped his horse 12 paces from the porch, and the men behind him spread out in a slow, even arc, the way men spread out who have done this kind of thing before. There was a long silence. The horses breathed. The lanterns hissed. Ezra Blackwood. "Sheriff, you have a fugitive in that house. Beatrice Green is wanted for theft of public funds out of Iron Creek Township. I have a warrant. I have come to take her." "You have no warrant." "I have a warrant in my saddlebag." "You wrote it tonight." "I am the law, Mr. Blackwood. What I write in a saddlebag at nightfall is the law by the time I read it from a porch." "Not in this county. Not after tomorrow."
The sheriff smiled. The smile reached the lantern light, and Adelaide, watching from the dark of the front window with the rifle braced on the sill, saw it for what it was. Not the smile of a man surprised, the smile of a man who had heard exactly the answer he had ridden up here to hear. "Then we will have to settle it tonight, Mr. Blackwood. Send the woman out. Send the Boston girl out. Send your brother out. I will leave you the house, and I will leave you your sister's grave, and I will ride." "My sister is not in her grave, Cornelius." The sheriff's smile did not move, but Adelaide saw very clearly the small twitch in the muscle of his jaw, the half-second pause before his hand went casually to rest on the butt of his pistol. "What did you say to me, Blackwood?" I said. Ezra Blackwood said in a voice that carried the length of the yard without being raised, that my sister Lenora is not in her grave and has not been and will be in this window in 5 seconds standing with a rifle on you, Sheriff, and that you and I both know what that means. The kitchen window beside Adelaide opened. Lenora Blackwood stood in it with her father's old buffalo rifle braced on the sill. The lantern light from the yard was just enough to show her face. The scar. The amber eyes. The mouth set in a line her brothers knew. A small sound went through the line of riders behind the sheriff. Not a word. A breath. The breath of 9 men recognizing all at once that they had been told one story for 3 years and had ridden out tonight on a different one. "I am alive, Cornelius," Lenora Blackwood said. "You sold me, and I am alive. The maid at Vane's house saw what hand the gun was in. There is a federal marshal on the road from Denver who has my brother's letter signed by the woman from Boston, and there is a witness in this house who will swear in a federal court that you spoke of me in her kitchen in the autumn of '75 in a way that will hang you. You can ride away tonight. You can ride south, and you can ride hard, and you can be out of this territory by morning. Or you can come up these steps. I will not ask twice." The sheriff did not ride away. He went for his pistol. He never cleared the holster. 2 rifles fired from the cabin in almost the same heartbeat from the front window and from the kitchen, and Sheriff Cornelius Holt went off the back of his horse into the trampled snow of the yard, with 1 shot through the right shoulder from Lenora and 1 through the right wrist from Adelaide, and his pistol fell into the snow without ever being raised, and the line of men behind him did not move. They did not move. 3 of them very slowly lifted both their hands. One of them, a younger man with a thin face, Adelaide did not know, said very clearly into the dark, "I rode for pay, Mr. Blackwood. I did not ride to die for him. I will lay down my gun." He laid it down. The man beside him laid his down. Then the next. Within the space of 1 minute, 8 of the 9 men who had ridden up Holloway Ridge with Sheriff Holt had laid their guns in the snow, and the 9th, who would not, turned his horse and put his heels to it and rode back down the meadow road into the dark, and no one fired on him. In the yard, in the lantern light, Cornelius Holt lay on his back in the snow with his right shoulder ruined and his right wrist ruined, and his fine black coat blooming with 2 slow stains. And he was not dead. He was looking up at the sky, with the strange, surprised expression of a man who has discovered at the very end of a long and clever life that he had been less clever than he thought. Ezra Blackwood walked down off the porch. He walked to where the sheriff lay. He stood over him with the rifle held loose in his right hand. He did not raise it. "Cornelius, Blackwood, you will not die tonight. Marshal Hayes will be here in 2 days. You will live to stand in his court. You will live to be looked at by my sister in a witness chair. You will live sheriff because I have decided that you will, and not because you have earned a single hour of it. You are a fool, Blackwood. Maybe. You should kill me. I know." He did not kill him. He took the pistol out of the snow. He took the badge off the fine black coat. He stepped back and he looked up at the porch and he said, "Adelaide." "Yes." "Bring me the long rope from the barn and the lantern. We are going to bind this man, and we are going to carry him into the back room, and we are going to keep him alive for 2 days. She came down off the porch with a lantern. She did not look at Cornelius Holt as she passed him. She walked across the yard to the barn through the line of men with their hands lifted, and the men parted for her, and one of them, the young one with the thin face, took off his hat as she went by. She did not see him do it. She was looking at the dark line of the timber above the meadow, where the road went up to the deer trail, where by now Silas Blackwood was somewhere beyond Rusted Spur on a hard-riding horse, with a federal marshal's name in his head and a brother's life on his back. She brought the rope. They bound the sheriff. They carried him into the back room. Beatrice Green took the shotgun and the chair beside the door, and she looked at Adelaide with her old, wet eyes, and she said, "I will sit with him, child. I have wanted to sit across from him with a gun in my lap for 3 years. You will not be alone. Send Lenora in only if she asks." "I will." It was almost midnight before the kitchen was quiet. Adelaide stood at the stove warming the last of the coffee. Lenora sat at the table with both her hands wrapped around an empty cup. Ezra was on the porch in the dark again. But the door was open this time, and Adelaide could see the line of his shoulder against the pale of the snow, and she could hear very faintly the low murmur of his voice as he spoke to old Boone, who had limped out and laid himself across his master's boots and refused to be moved. Lenora lifted her face. "Della?" "Yes. You stood by him." "I did. You will stand by him tomorrow." "I will. You will stand by him 40 years from now." Adelaide turned from the stove. She looked at the woman in her father's chair, who had her brother's eyes and her own scar, and 3 years of silence behind her, and she said, "Lenora, I did not come here to stay. I came here because I had nowhere else. I am staying because I have found in this kitchen, in this week, every single thing I did not know I had been looking for since my father died. I am staying because I love your brother. I have not yet told him so. I will tell him tomorrow in the daylight when there is no gun in any room of this house." Lenora Blackwood smiled for the first time since she had ridden up out of the dark. It was a small smile. It was very tired. It was the smile of a woman who had been carrying her own coffin on her back for 3 years and had just now set it down. "Tell him in the kitchen," Lenora said. "He hears better in this room than anywhere else in this house. Tell him by the lavender pot that has sage in it now. Tell him in the morning, Della, and let me hear it through the wall, because I have ridden too far in the cold not to hear at least one thing in this life turn out right." Adelaide crossed the kitchen and bent and kissed Lenora Blackwood on the top of the head, the way she had kissed her father at 12. "In the morning," she said. She poured the coffee. She carried 2 cups out onto the porch. Ezra Blackwood took his without looking at her, and he made room for her on the bench beside him, and old Boone moved his head onto her boot, and the 3 of them sat there in the cold and the dark on a porch in Colorado Territory in the small hours of the first day of November in 1878, and the snow began very lightly to fall. Ezra Blackwood, without turning his head, reached across the bench in the dark and took Adelaide Hartwell's hand in his. He did not say anything. He did not have to. She closed her fingers around his, and she held on, and the snow came down on the meadow, and somewhere across the dark country, on a hard road that bent toward Denver, Silas Blackwood was riding home. Morning came clean and cold and absolute. The snow that had fallen in the small hours had settled the world. The yard where in the lantern light there had been blood and tracked boot prints and the long stains of a man dragged across the porch lay even and white. It was as if the mountain itself had decided that the night was finished, and it was time now to begin a different country. Adelaide rose before the sun. She did not dress in the dark wool. She went to the wardrobe, and she stood for a long time with her hand on the door, and then she opened it, and she took down the green Sunday dress that Lenora Blackwood had sewn with her own not quite expert hand at 16 and never lived to wear in town. She pressed her palm to the bodice. She did not ask permission of any ghost. She put it on. The dress fit. It fit the way a thing made by one woman in love with the idea of a future fits another woman who has decided to claim that future on her behalf. She braided her hair. She came down the stair. The kitchen was empty. The stove was warm. The coffee pot was on. 3 sprigs of green sage stood in the lavender pot in the window, and the pale gold light of the rising sun came through the glass and fell across them, and Adelaide stopped in the middle of the kitchen and for a moment did not move. The door opened behind her. Ezra Blackwood came in with snow on his shoulders and the rifle in the crook of his arm, and he closed the door, and he set the rifle on the rack, and he turned, and he saw her in the green dress in the morning light, by the lavender pot with the sage in it. He did not speak. She did not give him time to. Ezra. Della. I need to say a thing in this kitchen. Lenora told me to say it here. She said you hear better in this room than anywhere else in this house. All right. I came to Holloway Ridge because I had nowhere else. That is the truth. I will not pretend otherwise. I did not climb that road for love. I climbed it because there was no other road left at the bottom of the mountain that I could walk. I know that. But I am not standing in this kitchen for any of those reasons anymore. He set down his hat very slowly on the table. Ezra Blackwood, I love you. I have loved you, I think, since the boarding house when you told me you wanted me as a wife and a witness both, and gave me the truth as if it was a knife laid flat between us, and trusted me to pick it up by the handle and not the blade. I love you. I will say it once in this kitchen, and I will not say it again until you have said it back to me, because I will not be a woman who begs. But I will say it once, and I will say it where the sage is, because the woman who planted the lavender that died in this pot deserves to hear at least one thing in this house turn out right. He crossed the kitchen. He did not run. He did not stride. He walked the way he walked on the porch in the cold, careful and deliberate, and he stopped a hand's breadth from her, and he looked down into her face, and he said in the voice he used for the most important things, the voice that did not need to be raised, Adelaide Hartwell, I have loved you since the moment you told the sheriff in front of his own street to take his hand off your person. I have loved you since you read Ivanhoe by the fire and lowered your voice for the part you knew was hurting me. I have loved you since you put sage in my sister's pot when you did not know my sister was still alive to be glad of it. I am 35 years old. I have buried more people than I have loved. I did not believe before you came up that road that I was a man who had any love left in me to give. I was wrong. I love you, Della. I will say it in this kitchen now, and I will say it in this kitchen every morning that I am alive in this house. He took her face between his two hands. He bent his head. He kissed her in the green dress by the lavender pot with the sage in it, in the gold light of the first morning of November. It was a long kiss and a careful one. When he let her go, Lenora Blackwood was standing in the doorway with one hand braced against the frame and the other pressed flat to her chest, and she was crying quietly the way a person cries who has been waiting 3 winters to be allowed to cry. And Adelaide held out one arm without leaving Ezra's, and Lenora came across the kitchen and stepped into the curve of her brother's other arm, and the 3 of them stood there in the kitchen in the gold light, and that was the morning the house began to be a house again. Marshal Tobias Hayes came up the road with 12 mounted men at his back at noon on the 3rd day after Lenora's return. He was a tall, narrow man in his early 50s, gray at the temples, with the tired, patient eyes of a man who has been hunting other men for 30 years and has become in the doing of it mostly kind. Silas rode at his right shoulder, gaunt and gray, with Rode the limp on him worse than Adelaide had ever seen it, but upright in the saddle and grinning in spite of himself when he came over the last rise and saw the cabin still standing. The marshal took one look at Cornelius Holt bound in the back room with Beatrice Green's shotgun across her lap and her old eyes very steady on him, and he said in a voice meant only for Ezra, "That man has been a problem to me for 10 years, Mr. Blackwood. I am obliged to you for keeping him alive. I would not have." "My woman would have," Ezra said. "She is the reason he is breathing." The marshal looked at Adelaide. He took off his hat. He did not say what he was thinking. He said instead, "Ma'am, I will need your statement." "You will have it." It was as Adelaide was crossing the porch with the marshal's clerk, with a clean sheet of paper in her hand, and the sun very bright on the snow, that Cornelius Holt made his last move. He had been bound at the wrists and the ankles with the rope from the barn, and his right wrist was ruined, but the left was not. And Beatrice Green, who had sat with him for 2 days and 2 nights, and slept perhaps 4 hours, in that time, had risen at the sound of the marshal's horses and gone to the kitchen window to see them come up, and in the half a minute that her back was turned, the sheriff worked the loop of rope at his left wrist with his teeth and freed his good hand, and drew from inside the band of his stocking the small derringer he had kept there for 15 years, against exactly such a moment, and he came up off the bed, and he came out of the back room into the kitchen, and he saw through the open front door the woman in the green dress on the porch in the bright sun signing her name to the paper that would put him on a federal scaffold, and he raised the derringer. 2 things happened in the same heartbeat. Old Boone, 15 years old and blind in one eye and asleep on the rug, did not move. Old Boone had not moved at the marshal's arrival because Old Boone had decided the marshal was not a stranger. But Old Boone had been tracking the breath of Cornelius Holt for 2 days through a closed door, and when that breath came out into the kitchen, the old yellow dog rose with a quickness that no one in that house had seen in 5 years, and he laid his teeth very precisely into the back of the sheriff's bad right wrist, and he did not let go. The sheriff fired. The shot went wide of where it had been aimed. It did not go wide of Ezra Blackwood, who had stepped through the front door of his own cabin, one stride ahead of Adelaide, the way he stepped through every doorway that led to the open since the night before, because he had been a soldier, and because he had decided in the small hours of the morning of the 1st of November that he would never again let his wife walk through a doorway in front of him in any house Cornelius Holt could see into. The bullet took him through the meat of the left shoulder in nearly the same place where the grape shot had taken him at Chattanooga in 1863. He did not fall. He turned, and he walked back into the kitchen, and he took the derringer out of Cornelius Holt's hand, while old Boone still had the wrist, and he laid the small gun on the kitchen table, and he looked down at the sheriff and said very quietly, "You should not have done that." Then he sat down slowly in his father's chair, and he closed his eyes, and the blood came through his shirt, and Adelaide came in from the porch with the unsigned paper still in her hand, and the marshal 3 steps behind her, and her own breath gone from her chest, and she went to her knees beside her husband's chair, and she pressed both her palms to his shoulder, the way a man at Vicksburg had once pressed his to a sergeant's throat, and she did not pray. She had no prayer. She had only the work of her hands. "Della." "Hush." "Della." "Hush, Ezra. Hush." "You are wearing my sister's dress." "I know." "It is too much green." "I know it is. Hush." He laughed once. It hurt him. He stopped. The marshal had a man who knew bullet wounds. The man came in. He worked over Ezra Blackwood for an hour at the kitchen table while Lenora held a basin and Adelaide held her husband's good hand and Beatrice Green wept quietly by the door. The bullet had gone through. It had taken muscle and a piece of the old scar tissue from 63 with it. It had not taken anything that would not heal. Ezra Blackwood lived. The marshal put Cornelius Holt in chains himself. He took the derringer for evidence. He took the printed letters Ezra had not, after all, burned, all of 3 of which he had hidden in a tin under the floorboard of the smokehouse against this very day. He took Adelaide's signed statement. He took Beatrice Green's. He took Lenora's, and that was the longest of them, and it took most of an afternoon. And when it was done, the marshal closed his book very carefully and set it on the table, and he did not look at any of them for some time. Then he said, "Ma'am, there has not been a witness in my courtroom in 20 years who was owed more, and I will see that this man stands in front of every grand jury in this territory before he hangs. You have my word." "Thank you, Marshal. You will be asked to come to Denver in the spring. I will come. Both of you. Both of us." The marshal rode out the next morning with Cornelius Holt across the saddle of a led horse in chains, and the 8 men who had ridden up the ridge with the sheriff and laid down their guns rode behind him, witnesses for the prosecution and free men for the moment, on the strength of it. The young one with the thin face turned at the bend of the road and lifted his hat to Adelaide, and this time she saw him do it, and she lifted her hand in return. The grand jury sat in Denver in March of '79. Lenora Blackwood walked into a federal courtroom in a dark blue dress with her hair pinned up plain and the scar bare on her cheek, and she sat in the witness chair and she looked at Cornelius Holt across a space of 15 feet, and she told what she could tell of 3 years. She did not tell all of it. She had told her brothers she would not, and she did not. She told what was needful. The judge wept in his chair and did not pretend afterward that he had not. The jury was out 40 minutes. Cornelius Holt was hanged the 2nd week of May, 1879,
in the yard of the territorial prison in Denver on a clear, bright morning, and Ezra Blackwood and Adelaide Hartwell did not attend because they had decided between them that they had given the man enough of their lives. They were married instead, on that day, by the same Marshal Tobias Hayes, on the porch of the cabin at Holloway Ridge, in the presence of Silas Blackwood and Lenora Blackwood and Beatrice Green, and a young woman from Iron Creek named Wilhelmina Green, who was Beatrice's grandniece and was 18 years old, and who had ridden up the ridge in Beatrice's wagon 2 months before to help nurse Ezra through the last weeks of his shoulder, and who had not, for reasons she could not explain to herself, ridden back down again. Silas Blackwood stood beside his brother as best man. He did not look at the bride during the ceremony. He looked the whole time at the dark-eyed woman from Iron Creek, who was his sister's friend, and Wilhelmina Green, who had a face like a winter pear, and a laugh like creek water, looked back at him steadily, and Beatrice Green, who had outlived 2 husbands and 3 sons, and who had not believed she would live to see another wedding. She liked the look of, sat in her wooden chair on the porch, with her old hands folded in her lap, and watched her grandniece watch a Blackwood, and did not speak for fear she would say the wrong thing. Adelaide wore the green Sunday dress. She wore it because the cream-colored wedding dress in the wardrobe upstairs belonged to a woman who had survived something that should have killed her, and Adelaide was a woman who had decided not to begin her marriage in a thing that was not hers. Lenora pinned the green wool at the throat with a small cameo. Adelaide's mother had left her in 1863, and she did not cry this time because she had cried in the kitchen 4 months before, on the morning of the green dress, and she had decided she had cried enough. Marshal Hayes read the lines of the territorial marriage form in a steady, careful voice. Ezra Blackwood spoke his "I will" in the voice he kept for the most important things, the voice he had used in the kitchen by the lavender pot. Adelaide spoke hers in the voice of a woman who had stopped running. When the marshal said by the authority vested, "You are husband and wife," Ezra Blackwood took her face between his 2 hands, the way he had taken it that first morning, and he kissed her slowly in front of all of them, and old Boone, who had been promoted that summer to an honored cushion by the porch rail, thumped his tail once against the boards. Silas married Wilhelmina Green in the spring of 1881 on the same porch, with much the same company, and Beatrice Green at last allowed herself to weep because she had suspected from the first wedding what would come of the second, and a woman of 70 who is right about a thing is permitted to weep when the thing comes true. Theodore Ezra Blackwood was born in March of 1880. Ezra delivered him himself with Lenora and the doctor from Iron Creek because the storm had closed the road and the doctor had been 3 hours late. The boy came hard. Adelaide labored from the night before until the gold light came up over the eastern ridge, and when it came and the boy with it, and the doctor laid him in his father's hands. Ezra Blackwood, who had buried a brother and a mother and a father and a sister, he had thought lost, and had been a soldier in a war that he did not speak of, sat down very slowly in the chair by the bed with a wet small thing in his arms, and wept without any sound. Adelaide watched him from the bed. She was tired beyond tired. She said, "Ezra, Della, he is yours. I know. You can put him down. You will not break him." "I know I will not. I am not going to put him down." He did not put the boy down for 2 hours. He held him through the doctor's leaving, and the morning chores, and the first grateful rest of the kitchen, and Lenora brought broth, and Beatrice Green came up from town with a basket, and Silas, who had been pacing the porch since first light, finally came in and looked at his nephew over his brother's shoulder, and said in his lighter Western voice that had gone in that moment a little thicker, "Brother, He has our father's nose. He does.
It is a hard nose to begin a life with. He will grow into it. He will.
Augustus. Silas Blackwood was born in the autumn of 1884. He came shouting and did not stop shouting for a week, and Silas, who held him first at his mother's bedside, said with great satisfaction, "Brother, this one is going to be the trouble." And Ezra said, "Good. We have been short of trouble in this house lately." And they both laughed, and Adelaide, who had borne the boy easily, and was sitting up against the pillow with her hair loose and her hand on her son's small back, said, "Out of my room, both of you. He is going to sleep, and so am I." They went out, both of them, but they did not go far, and through the open door she heard them on the porch for a long time talking quietly to each other in the voices brothers use when there is no one listening. And that was the sound more than any other that she would later remember as the sound of the years being good. Lenora May Blackwood was born in 1885 in summer, with the windows open to the meadow, and her Aunt Lenora's hand in her mother's the whole time. The girl came easy. She had her mother's blue eyes. She had her aunt's mouth. She was from the first day the steady one, the watchful one, the one who would walk out into a room of grown men and find the one who needed comforting and lay her hand on his knee. Lenora did not marry. She was asked twice by good men. She refused both times kindly. She told her brothers in the kitchen in the gold light of an autumn afternoon in 1887, "I have too much country inside me, brothers. I have walked too long alone. There is no man on this earth who can make a room more peaceful for me than my own room is in this house. I will not pretend otherwise to be polite." "All right, Lenora. All right, sister." She built over those years a small, clean cabin of her own at the upper end of the meadow, with a wide window that looked west to the divide. She kept bees. She kept a horse. She read, and she walked, and she planted lavender in clay pots in every south-facing window, and most of them against three brothers' old advice lived. In 1890, she began to write a book. She wrote it slowly in the evenings by lamp. She wrote it with the same careful copperplate she had used at 17. She did not show it to her brothers. She showed it page by page to Adelaide, who read each chapter at the kitchen table when the children were in bed and made small notes in pencil and gave the pages back without comment beyond what the writing needed. The book was called The Lost Sister of Holloway Ridge. It was published in Boston in the spring of 1892 by a small reputable house with a foreword by a woman from a benevolent society in New York who had come to know Lenora's correspondence. It told the story in unsparing but not graphic terms of a young woman who had been taken from her home in the Colorado Territory in the autumn of 1875 and sold against her will, and who had survived and who had returned to her family and to her country and to her name. It named no man who was still living. It was read by women in St. Louis and Chicago and Philadelphia and Boston and Sacramento. It was read aloud in some houses in the evenings to daughters who were of an age where their mothers wished them to know very plainly what the world was and how to outlast it. It went into a fourth printing in 1893. It is today in the library of Harvard College and in the library of a Methodist Mission Society in San Francisco, and in the small library of the Iron Creek Schoolhouse, where a copy with Lenora Blackwood's signature on the flyleaf is kept under glass. She made a small income from it. She sent most of it to a society in Denver that helped women off the streets. She kept enough to buy good seed and good tools and one piano,
which lived after 1894, in the front room of the main cabin against the wall where the long rifle had once been, and Adelaide taught the children to play it, and the children taught their cousins. The mountain changed slowly. In 1893, the railroad came as far as Rusted Spur, which was now a town with a courthouse and a school. In 1898, a road suitable for a buggy was cut from Iron Creek, which had elected a new sheriff 3 times by then. All of them honest, and the last of them was the young man with the thin face who had taken off his hat to Adelaide on a snowy October night long before. In 1902, the first telephone line came up to a junction 6 miles below the cabin, and in 1905, Silas, who had grown into something like the patriarch of the lower meadow, paid for a line to be run to his wife's kitchen because Wilhelmina Blackwood had said one too many times that she did not see why she should ride 3 miles to know whether her grandniece in town had had her baby. The cabin grew. Ezra and his sons added on year by year a larger kitchen, a second parlor, a long porch on the east face that caught the morning sun, a room for Lenora when she came down from her own cabin in the deep winters, a room for Beatrice Green at the back of the kitchen where the sheriff had been bound that one long night, and which had been ever since the warmest room in the house where the old woman lived in dignity until 1894, when she died in her sleep at 83, with Adelaide's hand on hers and Wilhelmina at the foot of the bed. They buried her under the sycamore by the lower spring where Mother was, and Caleb, and where there was a stone, now also for Lenora's 3 hidden years, that they had agreed between them to mark with a small marble lamb because it was a kindness to the country to acknowledge them. The cattle prospered. The horses prospered. The boys grew tall. Theodore was an even-tempered, scholarly child who at 14 wrote his grandfather's friend at Harvard in his grandfather's name, asking after a Greek dictionary, and at 21 rode the train east to study law. Lenora May was steady, watchful, observant, and at 19 married a young doctor from Denver who had come up to Iron Creek to fight a diphtheria outbreak, and had stayed after the outbreak was settled for reasons that became obvious to anyone who watched him watch her. They lived in Denver. They came up every summer with their children. Augustus, who had shouted for a week as an infant, grew up to be the loud, laughing one, the one who could ride anything with hooves, and at 23 he went into the territorial legislature on the strength of his name and his voice, and came home 10 years later, still a Blackwood, which was not a thing the territory could always say of its sons. Silas and Wilhelmina had 4 children of their own, 3 girls, and a boy who ran the meadow with their cousins as one tribe. And every spring on the 5th of May, Adelaide Blackwood and Ezra Blackwood walked together down to the lower spring in the morning, and they laid wildflowers on 5 graves, and they did not speak much because the country between them by then was a country that did not need speaking. It was the autumn of 1908 when Adelaide turned 54. The house had been full all week for the harvest gathering. Theodore had come up from Boston, where he had been called to the bar 3 years before with his wife Anna and their 2 boys. Lenora May had come up from Denver with her doctor husband and their 3 children. Augustus had ridden in from the legislature in Denver in the morning alone because his wife was due with their first and could not travel. Silas and Wilhelmina were at the table, gray-haired now, both of them, his limp, very bad, in the cold mornings, her laugh as steady as it had been at 18. Lenora was in her father's chair. She was 50 years old. The scar on her right cheek had faded almost to a thin silver line, and her hair was the iron color of a winter river, and she looked when she sat at the head of the table exactly the way her own mother had once looked, which was a thing none of her brothers would ever say aloud. Adelaide stood on the porch in the late afternoon in a dark wool dress over her green Sunday dress that she still wore on important days, with her hands resting on the rail Ezra had repaired 3 summers running because the house was old and willing to need repairing. She watched her grandchildren run through the meadow. There were 6 of them. There would be more. They were chasing each other through the wildflowers that Lenora and Lenora May had seeded together one spring afternoon 4 years before. The flowers had taken. The flowers had spread. The meadow in October was not what it had been in October of '78. The meadow in October now held bluebells and Indian paintbrush and columbine, and in 3 clay pots on the porch rail next to her hand, lavender alive and gone, slightly woody and smelling of summer. Ezra came out of the barn. He came slow. He was 65 years old. The shoulder bothered him in cold weather, both shoulders, now the old one and the new one. His beard had gone fully white. He still cut it short with a knife. His eyes had not changed at all. They were still the amber of a candle held behind whiskey, and they found her on the porch, and they held her, and he walked across the yard the way he had walked across the muddy street of Iron Creek 30 years before. Careful, deliberate, a man who had decided again to come and stand beside this woman. He came up the steps. He stood beside her at the rail. "Della, Ezra, you have been out here a while." "I have." "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking about a stagecoach." "Are you?" "I am thinking about a girl on a stagecoach with $7.40 and a letter she had not yet decided to believe in. I am thinking about a sheriff in a black coat. I am thinking about an old woman on a coach who put a piece of paper in the hand of a boy with a nickel. He laid his hand over hers on the rail. The hand was thicker than it had been. The pale, ropey scar ran across the back of it as it had at 35. "Della." "Yes." "Are you sorry you did not turn around?" She turned to look at him. The autumn sun was on his face. Behind him, through the open door of the cabin, she could hear Lenora laughing at something Augustus had said, and Wilhelmina answering, and a child calling for water, and Theodore somewhere telling his small son to put down a knife that did not belong to him. She put her free hand against her husband's chest. "Ezra Blackwood, there is no part of any day that I have lived in this country where I have ever been sorry. There are days I have been afraid. There are days I have been tired, beyond tired. There is one day in November of '78 that I have not entirely forgiven, and another in March of '80 when I thought we were going to lose the boy, and a week in '94 when we lost Beatrice. But sorry, no, my love, I have not been sorry. I have not been sorry 1 minute." "Good. And you, Della, are you sorry you wrote that advertisement?" He laughed. It was a quiet laugh, the laugh of a man whose face was not made for laughter and who had learned the sound late. "I am sorry," he said, "that I waited 3 years to write it. I am sorry I did not write it the autumn after Lenora went. I am sorry I made you wait in Boston for a man who did not yet know how to ask for the thing he needed. That is the only sorry I have." She rose on her toes and kissed him. He kissed her back. Behind them in the front room, somebody had begun to play the piano. It was Lenora May, picking out the air of an old hymn that Beatrice Green had liked, and the children's voices began to gather around it the way children's voices always did in that house when music began. "Ezra, Della, you are home. I am home, Della. Say the other one. You are home too, Della. I am home, Ezra. I have been home a long time. He took her hand. He led her inside. The kitchen was full. The whole family was at the table or near it or coming and going. Lenora was cutting bread. Wilhelmina was pouring coffee. Silas was in the rocking chair by the stove with a small girl on each knee. Theodore was at the head of the table because his father had told him to be. Augustus was at his mother's chair, holding it for her, and when she came in, he pulled it out and bowed her into it, and she smiled at him the way she had been smiling at him since he was the loud baby in the room above the kitchen. Outside, the sun was going down behind the western divide. The light on the meadow was the gold of an October that has decided to go gracefully. In a clay pot in the kitchen window, where there had once been dead lavender, and then sage, and then year by year lavender again, 3 blue-purple stalks stood a little woody and smelled of summer. Adelaide Blackwood, 54 years old, the orphan of a Boston scholar who had come west 30 years before with $7.40, looked down the long table of her family, and she did not speak because the speaking was being done by everyone else, and what she had to say was not in any case the kind of thing a person says out loud. She had stepped off a stagecoach into a town that did not want her. She had been told to go home. She had instead gone up. She had climbed a road that was not a road in the dark, beside a man who would not look at her into a house with a dead girl's wedding dress in the wardrobe, and a brother on the porch who had stopped sleeping in 75. She had stayed. She had stood longer. Outside in the meadow, she had married into the children of Holloway Ridge, ran through the wildflowers in the last gold light of the day, and her husband 65 years old and gray and amber-eyed and steady as the mountain itself leaned down and put one hand on the back of her chair and one on her shoulder and bent his head to her ear and said the words again the way he had said them every morning since the first. You are home now, Della. I am home now, Ezra. The sun went down. The lamps came up. The road below the cabin, the road that came up from Iron Creek, the road on which Cornelius Holt had once ridden with 9 men at his back and a fine black coat on his shoulders, was quiet and dark and full of nothing now but the small rustle of a mountain that after 30 years had decided to forgive the people on it. Inside in the warm kitchen, in the gold lamplight, in the smell of coffee and bread and lavender, the Blackwoods sat down to supper. That was the day Adelaide Hartwell's life had begun.